And welcome back, everybody. We're in the middle of day 4 here at the State of the World 2021 conference brought to you by Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, together with the McCain Institute, part of Arizona State University. And I'm David Kramer, still acting as your MC for this conference. And we're delighted now to turn to a panel that looks at the challenges in the Middle East. And we have assembled some familiar faces, I think, because our guests have been to most of the State of the Worlds in the past. And I'm also very pleased to introduce as the moderator for today's discussion, my good friend and colleague, Mohammed Gumrari, who is a current PhD candidate in the International Relations program and an adjunct professor for the Department of Politics and International Relations here at FIU. And he's also senior program coordinator for the Mohsin and Faiza Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies here at FIU. So Mohammed, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon to our audience. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today on this lovely afternoon. I'd like to just really quickly, David, give it up to you and your team, as well as the Stephen J. Green School and the McCain Institute, and all the other co-sponsors for putting together such a fabulous week of panels. It's been a very informative event this week. So kudos to you and your team and all the co-sponsors. With that being said, before I introduce our wonderful panelists today, I'd like to begin with framing our conversation. When we look at the Middle East and challenges in the Middle East, we really see a number of ongoing issues, some new, some old, and they consistently demand that we rethink the way we look and interact with the region. We have the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which still remains unresolved to this day. We have the signing of the Abraham Accords, which have changed dynamics in that region significantly. We also have the question of Iran and the Gulf states. We have a devastating war in Yemen, which has led to one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. And I think one of the most important things that should be noted is that this year marks exactly 10 years or 1 decade since one of the most contemporary major events took place in the Middle East. The Arab Springs and the consequent uprisings and protests for democracies and democratic reforms that took place in many countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa, which is why I think the name of this conference really is so fitting, the struggle for democracy, because this region has really struggled for democracy in the past decade and even beyond that. And yet 10 years later, we have protesters returning to the streets in Tunisia. We have unfinished business in countries such as Egypt. And so all of this should really make for an interesting conversation, as we really just barely scratched the surface. So my hope is that we can try to discuss as much of this as we can in the next hour. If you have any questions as we go through this panel, please send your questions in the chat box, and we will definitely try to get to as many questions from our FIU students as well as from the community as well. So here today to help me discuss some of these issues and more, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panel that we have here for you today. First, we have Elliot Abrams, who is the Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He also previously served as Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela at the Department of State. We also have Michelle Dunn, who is the Director and Senior Fellow in Carnegie's Middle East Program, where her research focuses on political and economic change in Arab countries, particularly Egypt, as well as U.S. policy in the Middle East. And finally, we have Stephen McInerney, who is Executive Director of the Washington, D.C.-based Project on Middle East Democracy. He has extensive experience in the Middle East and North Africa, including graduate studies of Middle Eastern politics, history, and the Arabic language at the American University of Beirut and the American University in Cairo. Unfortunately, Nancy O'Kale, who was set to join as one of our panelists, had a family emergency and is not able to join us today. So we send our best wishes to her. So panelists, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for today's lovely conversation. So let's just go ahead and dive right into it. We have a lot to talk about. We have very little time. So Elliot, I'd like to begin with you. You're a special representative for Iran at the Department of State. And I think one of the biggest questions Middle East experts are looking at is how is a Biden administration going to approach Iran juxtaposed to a Trump administration? I saw that you recently published an op-ed in the Washington Post on how you think the Biden administration should deal with Iran. So I open that question to you. How do you think the Biden administration should re-engage Iran? And what are your thoughts on the US possibly re-entering the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear agreement?
Thanks very much, Mohammed, and I'm delighted to be participating again this year. I think a lot of people expected that the Biden and Trump policies would be black and white or white and black, depending on which side you're on, completely different, instantly completely different. But that has not happened, which is kind of interesting. You've seen the new National Security Advisor, new Secretary of State, essentially say, hold on, we're not lifting sanctions. Iran has to come back into compliance with the JCPOA first. So all of the sanctions that existed on January 20th still exist. And it doesn't look as if they're going to disappear overnight. The administration has made clear that first they want to consult with European allies, with the P5+1, who joined in the JCPOA, with the allies and partners in the Middle East before anything changes. Now, my own view, as somebody who was not a supporter of the JCPOA, is that they should continue this go slow path. The government of Iran is under enormous economic pressure. It also has a presidential election in June. And if you look at this as a 4-year period of President Biden, you could even have a succession crisis because the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is old and hasn't been in great health. So they're under pressure. And I would say keep the pressure on, negotiate from strength, and negotiate something better than the JCPOA, something that does what people in this administration say they want: extend the years, extend the sunsets, and go from just nuclear to including the question of missiles and the question of Iran's conduct or misconduct in the region.
Great, thank you so much. Just to go ahead and respond to that, it seems that with Iran and the United States, as you mentioned, both countries are sort of in a tug of war of who's going to give up something first in order to return to the agreement. Iran is saying that the U.S. needs to relieve sanctions before they will bring down any sort of return to the agreement. And the U.S. is saying the same thing. They want Iran to sort of make the first move. So what do you make of that? And who do you think is going to give in first?
Well, the Iranians are doing what is, from their point of view, intelligent, right? They keep departing further and further from the JCPOA. They are supposed to have 500 kilograms of enriched uranium. They now have more than 2,000. They're supposed to enrich no more than 3.67%. They're now enriching, they say they are soon to be enriching on up to 20%. More modernized, later stage centrifuges, not the so-called IR1 or 2, but 6 or 7. And it's a game of chicken. It's saying to the Americans and others, we're going to continue this unless you change your behavior. There is a limit to how far Iran can go there because, for example, if they said, we're going to throw out all the IAEA inspectors, I think you'd get Russia and China to join the US in the IAEA board to say, you can't do that. That's a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in addition to being a violation of the JCPOA. And they do get, at the far end of this, if it is thought that they're really moving toward a nuclear weapon, you're going to get at least Israel and the United States saying, you can't do that. I mean, President Biden believes whatever it is, 4 or 5 predecessors believe, that we're not going to permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon. So at this point, you've correctly characterized it. I mean, I think it's a tug of war. It's a game of chicken between the two sides. But I think the United States is in a position of strength because of the effectiveness of sanctions. So I don't think we should lift sanctions until we really get something for it.
And so before I bring Michelle and Stephen in this, I want to go ahead and just ask, what do you make of Europe's take on all of this? I mean, we saw that when Trump withdrew unilaterally from the agreement, Europe sort of, and the European Union and the other countries in the agreement tried to hold on to it for about as long as they could. What is Europe's role in all of this?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, we're talking really about France, Germany, England, and the EU. And they all support the JCPOA, and they want the United States back in the JCPOA. But they do have differing views. I mean, Germany has been, if I can put it this way, a lot softer. France has been a lot tougher. The French actually thought that we could have had a better deal than the JCPOA and that it was not well negotiated. And they're almost in a funny position. In the Obama years, they were, if you will, to our right, saying be tougher. In the Trump years, they were, in a sense, to America's left, saying, whoa, 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 don't throw out the whole JCPOA. Now they may be going back to a harder line again and saying to the Americans, now don't give it all away, toughen up. I don't know what role the British will play, because previously, when all this was happening, 2013 to 15, under Obama, under Trump, they were in the EU. So Britain as an independent voice here outside the EU is something new. And we're going to have to see how that plays out. But I'd watch France, because I think they will have a good deal of influence.
Thank you, Elliot. With that being said, Michelle, I'd like to bring you into the conversation as well. In our email communications, you mentioned something that intrigued me. You said the geopolitical underpinning of the region based on oil and gas is coming apart, and that the future, and so I'd like you to expand upon that if you can. And obviously, the other part you mentioned is the future of the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. Obviously, that has a lot to do with Iran as well as other security measures in the region. But I'd love if you could expand upon that a little bit. And what do you see as the future of geopolitics in the region? And what is the future of the U.S. military presence in the Middle East?
Thanks, Mohammed. Great to be with you and with all our friends at FIU. So, look, if we're looking at the beginning of a new administration, the Biden administration coming in, and the questions that you asked sort of tee up for me two big challenges that I think they will face in the Middle East over the next 4 years. One of which they're already focused on, and one maybe not. The one they're already focused on is this issue of US military presence, because President Biden, like in a way President Trump and President Obama before him, wants to diminish the US military presence in the region and the overall investment of US effort and so forth in this Middle East region of the world compared to other regions and other challenges. But the question is how to do that. Right. And that's not easy to figure out. Certainly, I think the administration sees, some sort of progress on the Iranian nuclear program and the whole question of non-proliferation to be part of that picture. Right. Because obviously, not only do they not want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but they wouldn't want Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, et cetera, to follow on. And then we have a nuclear weapons proliferation in the Middle East. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is in terms of US conventional military presence and so forth. I think we're going to have a debate. We're already seeing it play out a little bit. What's the best way to do this? Some of the US allies in the region really want the US to pour advanced arms into this region. And the theory behind that is the more that the US arms its allies and they can defend themselves, then, that will stabilize the region. And also the US can sort of back out because our allies will all be able to defend themselves. But there is a real question about that, right? Pouring these arms in, will it stabilize the region? And will the US really be able to withdraw? What we're seeing now, for example, is some questions about the arms deal that the Trump administration gave to the United Arab Emirates after it normalized relations with Israel. It's a huge package of very sophisticated arms, including F-35 fighter aircraft, armed drones, and other things. What the Biden administration has done is just kind of press the pause button on this. They haven't said that they won't deliver the arms, but they're asking some questions, and these have to do with all kinds of things, like how are some of these partners, including the UAE, using the arms that the US and others have given them previously in the region, whether we're talking about interventions in Yemen, in Libya, etc. Have they been using these arms to stabilize the region, or are they destabilizing the region with these arms? And then there's the question of transfer. In whose arms will these, in whose hands will these weapons ultimately end up? So, that's one question. And it has, it's very much related to all the US allies in the region, the US relations, the Biden administration's relations with Israel, with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, and others. With many of them, there are a lot of problems on the table. I sometimes think as Joe Biden looks at this region, he must think, like, with friends like this, who needs enemies? We've got some real adversaries like Iran and maybe the al-Assad regime in Syria, but all these allies are quite troublesome. Just quickly, the other question, the one in which I think, I'm not sure the Biden administration is really thinking about this yet, is this political economic question. We're looking at the sunset of the oil and gas era, right? It's not going to come tomorrow, but it's coming, and we can see the signs of it. And the pandemic accelerated that time. We've seen global demand for oil and gas falling, and the whole political economy of the region is built on this, is built on, governments drawing their revenue out of the ground instead of taxing citizens and being accountable to them for the most part, and spreading that wealth around. And a lot of the governments and regimes in this region exist either on hydrocarbon revenues, or they derive political rents that are secondary to them. This is all changing, and I'm convinced that the uprisings that we've seen over the last 10 years are related to that breaking apart of this old political economy that the Middle East has had, and that we're going to see this go on. I think the pandemic pressed the pause button on protest in the Middle East. There were some, pretty big uprisings going on in just even in 2019, right? In Algeria, in Lebanon, in Sudan. And then, and those, some of them, Algeria particularly, just kind of has been put on pause. I think as the pandemic recedes, as the fear of contagion gradually recedes, let us hope, next year, say, but the economic suffering brought on by the pandemic goes on, which I think it will. And then that's compounded by the dislocations of the declining value of oil and gas, the declining ability of the Gulf countries to absorb excess labor from the other economies of the region, and all of that. I think we're going to see political turmoil internal in countries return to this region, as we saw in 2011, 2012, and again in 2019. I think it's going to happen again, perhaps, as soon as later this year or next year. And that over the course of Biden's term, this might very well come to some US allies in the region, which is very hard for the US to handle. And I'm not sure, that the Biden administration is at all prepared for this, as the Obama administration was not prepared for the Arab Spring in 2011. And I don't know how much they've thought about, what would it take for the United States to be part of building an international enabling environment to support, constructive political transitions in these countries. I think we flunked that the first time around with the Arab Spring.
Thank you, Michelle. All great points. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that turmoil has already returned as we see protests happening since last year in countries like Algeria, even Tunisia. So I think that's a great transition point. Stephen, I'd like to bring you into the fold as well. I know that your research focuses mostly on democratization and human rights in MENA. As we see, I mean, we're 10 years after the Arab Spring. We have protests returning back in countries, in many of these MENA countries. Tunisia, which was sort of the lone case of democracy that arose out of the Arab Spring. So where are we 10 years after the Arab Spring, and what does the future hold for that region as far as democratization or the lack thereof?
Thanks, Mohammed. I mean, these are fundamental and important questions, and I think that these questions, sort of, as you noted, are in line with the theme of the entire conference this week: the struggle for democracy. I also think these questions are very intimately related to all the questions of stability and security and political economy and oil and gas, and also the challenges of confronting countries like Iran that Michelle and Elliot have already talked about. The struggle for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa remains very much underway, despite the difficulties of the past decade and widespread violence in many countries such as Syria, Libya, Yemen. The citizens of the region, it's clear, still want their rights to be respected. They still are very unhappy with these corrupt, stagnant dictatorships that repress them, abuse their rights, and are also unable to deliver for them, economically. And so we see very widespread dissatisfaction and successive waves of protests. And you and Michelle, mentioned those in 2019 in Algeria and Sudan. You mentioned Tunisia. Tunisia is the only country that remains democratic today after transitioning following the uprisings in 2011. But Tunisia's democracy is extremely fragile today. Tunisia faces a very serious economic crisis. Its political leadership, appears relatively weak at the moment. And according to recent public opinion polling, arguably the most popular political party in Tunisia is led by Abir Moussi, who openly praises the Ben Ali dictatorship and is openly anti-revolution. And so what you're seeing in Tunisia is really important progress that was made in terms of democratization, writing a new constitution, having elected governments, not accompanied by economic prosperity. And all of the factors that have been mentioned, including the changing role of oil and gas in the economy of the region, as well as most recently the COVID pandemic, have exacerbated these issues. Michelle mentioned that the international community had really flunked the test of providing support to these transitions over the past decade. And I think that's true in Tunisia as well. And I would hope that will change, but I'm not confident that it will. I hope that the Biden administration will not continue to sort of overlook Tunisia as U.S. officials have over the last several years. Tunisia deserves international support. Its success as the lone democracy in the Arab world, I think, is enormously important for the entire region. As I see it, the most important fundamental root cause of violence and instability across the Middle East and North Africa is the brutal repression of authoritarian regimes and the failure of these regimes, which are corrupt and not accountable to their population, to provide for their citizens. And until the region is governed by stable democratic governments, I think we'll continue to see various violent conflicts and armed conflicts across the region. Tunisia is the one hope at the moment to establish a model of a successful, prosperous, stable democracy. And I think the entire world of democratic countries, including in the U.S. and in Europe, should be very seriously invested in the success of Tunisia in ensuring that it doesn't slide back towards authoritarianism. And so this is something that I hope the Biden administration will prioritize. Sadly, frankly, we haven't seen any signs up till now that they will.
Thank you, Stephen. You mentioned a good point about Tunisia. In fact, just a few days ago, I saw a story on Vice News, and they were interviewing some young men in Tunisia about why they were protesting. And I think one of the largest issues they had was it was economic, the lack of economic opportunity. And I think we see this throughout the entire region of the Middle East. It's largely young people, marginalized, no opportunities, highly educated in some areas, and yet no good jobs. how do we tie this in into the way these governments in countries like Tunisia and others as well? I mean, I think we see similar stories in Lebanon and many other Middle East and MENA countries. So how do we tie this piece together? The reason I brought up that Vice story is because one of the protesters they were interviewing made a very interesting point that stuck with me. He said, "I don't want to hear from anybody who's over 30 years old." And I thought that spoke volumes in terms of this being sort of a revolution, mostly for the young people, a largely marginalized young demographic who lack opportunities in these host countries. So what do you make of that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that characterization is right. I think it's also important to remember that the young people, say under 35 in this region, are actually the majority. You know, it's a very young region. We have a real boom kind of demographically of a generation that is larger than their parents' generation, sees the world differently, and is less willing to accept a status quo that they see is not working for them. And so as far as what should be done to kind of help address some of these economic opportunities, what I would recommend is in the countries that have made positive steps, in the countries where there's real progress politically, and Tunisia is the best example of that. I think that, as I said, the international community should be very invested in the short term in helping to provide economic opportunities for these young population, but not in a everlasting way. I don't think that we want Tunisia or any of these other countries to remain dependent on external support or external economic investment. But in the short term, we should provide that support to help provide those economic opportunities, while at the same time using the leverage provided by that support to help ensure that these governments take serious steps to reform their economies. Tunisia's economy has not been transformed, has not changed over the past decade the way that its political system has on the surface. Many of the old corrupt families that controlled Tunisia's economy a decade ago still more or less are the dominant economic players, and there hasn't been real serious efforts by Tunisia's newly elected political leaders to take on these interests. And I think the international community, that should be invested in the success of Tunisia's democracy, should help them do so. Help give Tunisia's political leaders the confidence to kind of take on the old entrenched elite interests and to open up opportunities and competition for the younger generation that is very disillusioned. And at the same time, these reforms would allow sort of sustainable change that would deliver moving forward.
Absolutely. Elliot, Michelle, I would like to open the floor to you as well. Let's have a conversation. So please, if you feel like butting in at any time or have some remarks or comments to make, please feel free to butt in. Michelle, what is your take? Go ahead. Yes.
Well, I actually wanted to add something to what Steve was just saying about economic opportunity and so forth. And I agree with what he said. Another point is that the role of the International Monetary Fund, for example, and other loaners, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the African Development Bank, and so forth, is really important here. And of course, during the pandemic, these lenders, especially the IMF, have moved a lot of money out the door, with very few conditions, and that's understandable, in a crisis. But a lot of countries in this region are becoming heavily indebted to the IMF, and I think that the IMF has not always imposed the sort of conditions it should, and that's partly because member countries like the United States and others have not asked the IMF to impose the conditions that it should. Let me just give you one example, and that's Egypt. Egypt has taken on a lot of external debt in the last 5 years or so. It has carried out a series of sort of budgetary reforms, pulling back subsidies, raising some taxes and so forth. But there are some really big problems with the underlying economy that are related to the politics that the IMF hasn't touched. For example, the role of military companies in the economy, and the fact that it's a very tilted playing field in Egypt, and increasingly so since the 2013 military coup. The military has always played, or for a long time has played, a big role in the economy in Egypt, but it has gotten much more so. There have been all kinds of changes in law and procedures, and we've seen military companies moving in and taking over whole sectors of the economy, for example, the production of cement, and driving out private sector competition. The IMF hasn't said a word about this, and it's a major factor, right? So I think what we have now is we have an opportunity. I hope the United States and other nations will take it to engage more seriously with these international lending institutions on what kind of conditions they need to place on further lending, so that things that are done inside these that really enliven the economy. But let me just say, this whole region, this whole Middle East, North Africa region, basically is very private sector hostile. These are very much, we've got governments sometimes controlling the economies, or we have a private sector, but it's captive by the elite. And there's nothing like a level playing field. Many people are excluded, a huge number of people in informal economies and this sort of thing. And this just doesn't get fixed, and unfortunately, I have to say, I think we have a situation where the elite in these countries in the Middle East speak to the elite here and in Europe and within these, and it all becomes a very closed game, and we see the problem. As Stephen said, we have very much growing populations in much of the Middle East, in many of the countries of the Middle East, rapidly growing populations, very youthful populations, declining oil and gas sectors. These people are going to have to be employed, whether in manufacturing, services, et cetera. And it's going to have to be primarily the private sector that does it. So, there's an opportunity for policy engagement by the United States here, which is done primarily through the Treasury Department, working, for example, with the IMF and so forth. We have the opportunity to do that. I think that's one of the more effective things the United States could be doing now to help these peoples in these countries in the Middle East find their way, to new economies.
All very good points, Michelle. Elliot, I think I saw your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to go back to what Michelle began with, because I think it's fundamental. The move away from the oil economy. It's happening, as she said. I mean, we saw, what was it, last week or a few days ago, GM announcing they won't be making gasoline engine cars by 2035. We've seen countries say that. States in the US say that. It's going to happen. It's not, 2022 won't look all that different, but 2032 already will look quite different. I think there is one country, you might say, that's sort of getting ready for it, and that's the UAE, which has this incredibly huge sovereign wealth fund, which is already producing more money than the country earns from oil. But they're in a great situation because they have a lot of oil and not very many citizens. You say the same thing of Qatar. But if you look at some of the others, Bahrain, Algeria, of course, Saudi Arabia, which has a large population now, well over 30 million, this is going to be hugely disruptive. I think one could say that Mohammed bin Salman gets it, but he has not been able to make the kind of economic changes that they're definitely going to need, or there's going to be a kind of crash. The region's been living on oil since, let's say, the end of World War II at the very latest. It'll be close to a century, but then it's going to come to an end, and they're not ready.
Thank you, Elliot. No, I think you're absolutely right. Mohammed bin Salman absolutely gets it. You've seen him start to diversify the investments that Saudi Arabia is making, and trying to get off of the oil dependency that Saudi Arabia has enjoyed for decades. Um, so with that being said, I'd like to take a pivot here. I think one of the
Can I comment on that before we move on?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to comment. I mean, you and Elliot both saying that Mohammed bin Salman gets it. I think that's true in a very specific and narrow sense, that he does demonstrates recognition that Saudi's economy needs to change, and the oil and gas dominated economies will change. I think he fundamentally does not get some of the most important ways in which the economies must change. I think that he's trying to transform Saudi's economy in a completely top-down approach driven by him and a couple of his advisors. And I think that approach is doomed to fail. I think that the countries of this region, if they're going to succeed in transforming their economies, they have to allow their citizens to be part of that. They have to benefit from the expertise that exists in their country. They have to be willing to have a kind of open debate and dialogue about how to undertake this transformation. So currently, I see Mohammed bin Salman's approach and his vision for Saudi Arabia's future is absolutely doomed to fail, because he is committed to changing the economy while actually further centralizing political power within himself and his closest advisors and family members, and shrinking political power among a broader segment of the Saudi population, which is exactly the opposite of what's needed for economic success there. And I think the same could be said about the UAE and other countries in the region that want to change their economy, recognize that need, but as I see it, sort of are blindly committed to doing so without any political liberalization, which to me will doom those countries economically as well.
If I could jump in, just to make that more concrete, I think, what happens, in a lot of these cases is that these governments, they have these plans, the 2030 vision or what have you, and they get it, as Steve said, in terms of, yes, we have to diversify the economy. But then when it comes to something like transparency, right? The rule of law, how contracts and disputes are settled, the things that we all know are needed for investment, for foreign investment, as well as even, domestic investment and so forth. They're not willing to go there. And as I said, they want to largely keep the economy, a captive game for a relatively small group. And, so this ends up being a real problem. I mean, and we've seen what's happened with the Saudi Aramco and things like that, when they just kind of, say they want to go there and do the things that are necessary to bring in investment and diversify the economy, but then they're not really ready to go there.
Absolutely. I mean, good points. And I think we could take that conversation in that direction. But we are getting a few questions in, which is great here. But before I move to those questions, I wanted to pivot really quickly and talk about the Abraham Accords. I mean, I think that is just something that is very contemporary. We've seen 4 now Middle East or Muslim majority countries go ahead and sort of sign normalization deals between Israel and the United States. So I think we need to discuss this before we move to our questions. So Israel has said that its relationship with governments in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, that these are all important pillars in their regional security, and especially crucial to Israel's strategy to counter Iran. Now, these normalization deals, we haven't seen any normalization deals since Egypt in '79, and then Jordan in 1994, respectively. And then we fast forward to 2020. What do you, and I'd like to open this up to the entire panel. What do you make of these Abraham Accords? Obviously, there's benefits in all these countries. I mean, we've seen why the UAE has done it, Bahrain, Morocco. So each country has sort of signed on to these normalization agreements for their own geopolitical or strategic interests. But what do you see? How do you see this as impacting the region? Do you see this as a broader sort of creation of an anti-Iran coalition between Gulf states and Israel? What do you make of this? Elliot, let's start with you.
Okay. Yes, all of the above, I guess, is the answer. There's no question that Iran is a critical part of this. I mean, if people say, who gets the credit for this? Trump gets the credit, Kushner gets the credit. Yes, the Ayatollah Khamenei gets a lot of credit for this. I mean, it is an anti-Iran coalition in quite substantially of countries that are quite concerned about Iranian policy in the region, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon. In a way, you could stand back and say, why didn't this happen before? Part of the answer to that is this, I guess the way I'd put it is liberation from Palestinian politics. For a very long time, Arab officials have been critical of Palestinian governance. And in some ways that's been unfair, but in other ways it's been fair. I mean, they've watched first Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas turn down, President Clinton and Ehud Barak and turn down Ehud Olmert and turn down George Bush and turn down Barack Obama. And the answer was always no. And I think in a lot of cases, Arab officials have finally said, look, we love you, we're for you, we care about you, or at least our populations do. These are still domestic issues in Arab countries, but we're not going to have our national security policy held hostage. We'll give you foreign aid, we'll talk to the Israelis about this, we'll talk to the Americans about it, but we're not going to have you now remain an obstacle to doing what we think is in our national security interest and in our economic interest. So it is partly in the context of Iran, but it's also, I think, a vote of no confidence in the Palestinian leadership.
Interesting. Michelle?
Thanks. Yeah, let me add some other dimensions to this question as well. I think you asked, Mohammed, why did this happen? Or maybe Elliot asked, why did these normalization agreements happen now as opposed to at other times? And I do agree that I think that the weakening of the Palestinian leadership and the ineffectiveness of it and everything is part of the picture. But let me add a couple of other things. One of them is that I think the Trump administration was willing to pay prices for these normalization agreements, specific prices, country by country, that frankly, its predecessors might have hesitated to do. And even that there is some hesitation, I think, on the part of the Biden administration about how to deal with this now. For the United States, for example, to basically accept the Moroccan government position on Western Sahara. I mean, that's what Morocco got out of it. Mm-hmm. Sudan got, being taken out of the state sponsor of terrorism status. I mean, maybe that was going to happen anyway, but then this very large arms deal I mentioned to the UAE. I think that, some other, the Obama administration, for example, would have asked, gee, are we going to be setting off an arms race in this region by a new chapter in the arms race by giving, F-35 fighter aircraft to the UAE? The Trump administration, was just willing to do that, was willing to, to shove these things out the door and say, we don't care, it's fine, we're not worried. We're not worried about the repercussions of these steps. So that's one reason. The other reason I think is related to this question of the changing nature of this region, the changing and frankly diminishing importance of this region, and particularly the diminishing importance of the Gulf states. And I think that no one would accuse the leadership of the UAE of not thinking ahead, right? They very much they're thinking ahead, they're looking at the chessboard, they're trying to figure out how they can improve their position and improve their position relative to not only others in their region, but some of their closest allies. So just from my point of view, I mean, we said this is an anti-Iran alliance. Well, that's what it may be from the Israeli point of view. That's what it may be from the US point of view. I think from the UAE point of view, it's at least as much anti-Turkey as it is anti-Iran. And also, I think it's very much related to the Emirati sense that, I mean, they can see they're a very small country, you know, in a region of declining importance to most of the world. I think they can see that they're, you know, as Elliot said, 10, 12 years from now, they're going to be less important than they are now. So how do they secure their role? How does the current Emirati leadership secure its hold on power? Well, what they've decided to do is hitch their wagon to the Israeli star. That's what they've decided. Israel is going to be our key ally, you know, the strongest military power in the region. We're going to make ourselves their best friends, and we're going to make sure they're invested in us, in our country, and in the continuation of this particular leadership. And by the way, the Emiratis outflanked the Saudis in doing that. That they managed to get there first, and you know, and to secure for themselves a special role. I mean, one thing I found really interesting, if you actually read the normalization agreement between the UAE and Israel, it talks about, Elliot might remember the exact words that they use, but it's like, it's more than a strategic dialogue. It's something, a strategic conversation among Israel and the United States and the UAE, sort of to plan the future of the region. I mean, I can tell you people in some other Arab countries like Egypt sort of looked at that and said, oh, really? Now the UAE is going to, you know, dictate the future of the region or whatever. But what I'm saying is, I think the Emiratis thought by making this agreement, they are sort of securing for themselves a special and important role, you know? So it's much bigger, I think, than just, oh, let's band together against Iran.
No, absolutely, Michelle. I think both you and Elliot make very important points. You know, Elliot, you mentioned the Palestinian leadership. Actually, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority have just announced, Mahmoud Abbas has just announced that they will hold elections later on this year, which is long overdue. And it's also been said that, you know, surveys have found that the majority of Palestinians actually don't approve of his leadership. But is there any really other viable candidate for Palestinian leadership? And Michelle, you know, you also bring up good points. I mean, it seems that, you know, as I mentioned, every country sort of did this for their own intrinsic strategic interest. But I do want to pose another viewpoint or perspective from this. Many of these countries that Israel has signed these agreements with, these normalization agreements with, they have records of serious human rights violations. They're also very highly unpopular amongst the internal population of these countries. I mean, you saw protests break out as these countries announced these normalization deals with Israel. So is this good company? I mean, is this the sort of company that you want to be making peace agreements with? What does this do for the internal politics of these countries? And then finally, at the end of the day, these Abraham Accords have not settled the root cause of the conflict to begin with. It has not changed any dynamics of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. So what do we make of that? I mean, shouldn't we be getting somewhere in the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians before Israel goes into the broader context of normalizing relations with other Arab nations? And I guess I open this up to the entire panel, or Stephen, if you'd like to comment on it first, but I open that to the entire panel for anyone who'd like to comment.
Sure, I'll comment on parts of that. Yeah, I definitely agree that these regimes, as you note, are not popular They're not representative of their population. As Elliot noted, these normalization agreements are not popular with the populations. These are steps taken by the regimes based on the interest of those regimes. And I agree with everything that Michelle said, that I think it's important to view these in the context of everything else that we've been discussing about the declining economic strength of these states, the extra pressure that's been brought on by COVID, and that pandemic. And in addition, these regimes are committed to their own survival. And I do think that Israel is making a strategic mistake by putting itself fully in bed with really odious authoritarian regimes in the region. And I think we've seen over the past decade that odious repressive authoritarian regimes in the region are not as stable as they've often presumed to be. In the past decade, we've seen 6 Arab head of states of authoritarian regimes ousted from power by popular uprisings. And these monarchies want to believe that they're immune to that and say that they can ignore the opinions of their population and take these steps that bring benefits, that bring arms deals, as Michelle noted, that bring recognition, US recognition of Moroccan sovereignty of Western Sahara, instead of taking the kinds of reforms that are needed for their country. That they're looking after only their own sort of narrow power and grip on power, and that, I really see that as driving all of their decisions and driving these decisions as well. And one other element that I think is important to mention here is that some of these governments also were concerned about their relationship with the new Biden administration. And, maybe pointing to the UAE in particular, we've seen very strong criticism in the last year and a half by President Biden on the campaign trail, by his then leading campaign advisors, who are now his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, of the UAE and of Saudi Arabia and of massive arms sales to these countries. And rhetoric that those arms sales wouldn't continue and that the posture towards those countries would be different. And I think a significant part of the motivation here also was to do something that would be seen as very popular in Washington and with the new administration and among many members of Congress, including Democrats on Capitol Hill. And I think that was also a really important factor here.
Can I jump in?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, first, I think it is a fact that the Israelis don't concern themselves with the internal democratic or human rights situation of the countries with which they do business. And, what they'll say to you is, look, we'll make peace with anybody who'll make peace with us. We were completely isolated. We want to break down the isolation. We're not going to say no. I do think each case is different. In the case of the UAE, for example, if you look at the Edelman Worldwide annual survey of which populations think their governments are effective and efficient, Singapore and the UAE generally come out on the top. In the case of Morocco, the king has actually been doing a kind of opening to the Jewish community, which is tiny, but to the Moroccan community in Israel, and restoring Jewish history in Morocco, rebuilding synagogues and restoring cemeteries and so forth, to kind of put that history back in the history of Morocco. This kind of fits. Now, how unpopular is it? I think that also varies from country to country. You mentioned, of course, the 2 oldest peace treaties are Egypt and Jordan. Opinion polls in Jordan are terrible when it comes to Israel, and they don't change. I mean, year after year after year, there's enormous hostility to Israel and to the peace agreement and to having more commerce with Israel. It might turn out to be better in Morocco. I mean, we're just going to have to see. Again, the Emirates have it kind of easy because their population mostly consists of expats rather than citizens. But again, from the Israeli point of view, they would just say to you, all irrelevant. Anybody who wants to make peace, we'll sign.
Yes, go ahead, Michelle.
I just want to add a word on the Palestinians, because it hasn't really been addressed. Look, we've discussed already the kind of political crisis, of the Palestinian leadership, the ineffectiveness, the, lack of democracy, the declining popularity of the Palestinian leadership, all of that is true. And that has made, the Palestinians have really kind of lost a lot of their political weight in the region, and it's made the other Arab governments able to ignore them and, to cash in on, other benefits and other interests they can get by normalizing with Israel. This is all true. However, what I want to say is that, what we're seeing, I think, is, there's a big change underway in Israel Palestine, and what we are seeing is that the two-state solution that was long hoped for, negotiated for, so forth, is becoming impossible. And that's, there are many reasons for it, but the primary reason is Israeli settlements, is the huge expansion of Israeli settlements and everything, the whole infrastructure and everything related to them. Now, but the Palestinians are still there, right? And obviously, demographically, if you look at Israel, the West Bank, particularly if you include Gaza as well, Palestinians are in that whole area are already half or more than half of the population. And so, this issue, I think it's not over. And there will be, I think, another chapter in the Palestinian political history. They have since 1988, they have formally gone for a two-state solution, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. I think the Palestinians are kind of just, at sea, because it's clear now that isn't going to happen. So what is going to happen? And I think eventually there will be a new Palestinian political consensus, and there will probably be a new or some changes in the Palestinian political movement as Palestinians mobilize behind whatever it is. So there will be another chapter. This story is not over, I believe. When that will happen, is very difficult to say. I mean, it could start next week. It could be years in the future.
Thank you, Michelle. On that note, we have questions coming in, and I believe we have about 20 minutes left. So I want to go ahead and start moving to our questions. I'm going to start here with our first question, Teresa Schuster. She's an FIU political science student, and she's asking about gender equality in the Middle East. And she says that gender equality is largely lacking in many countries in the Middle East, and that women still face significant barriers in terms of political participation. Is there a way for the U.S. to further promote gender equality in Middle Eastern countries? And in what ways could this be done most effectively, helping the region to move towards greater democracy?
Well, shall I address that?
Sure, go ahead, Michelle.
Okay. Yeah, Teresa is quite right about this. I mean, one of the things I think, we've been talking about the need for economic change, economic diversification, growth of private sectors and so forth in the Middle East. The Middle East, North Africa region is the lowest region in the world in terms of women's participation in the labor force. So that's a huge factor here. And it's directly related, of course, also, I think, to political participation and so forth, right? Women. So what we've seen is that, women's education in this region has come a long way. And in many cases, there are more women receiving university degrees and so forth than there are men. And so I think, it's a matter of time in terms of, and women's participation in the labor force has certainly improved in a lot of places. We're even seeing it start to improve in places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and so forth, the more conservative societies. One interesting note, Stephen has talked a lot about Tunisia, which is so important. I think the fact that women's rights were sort of, and women's equality, while far from perfect, was sort of much better in Tunisia than any other Arab country. And that's been the case for decades. Yeah. It goes back to the 1960s and Habib Bourguiba and so forth. I think that was a real factor in Tunisia's ability to convert its uprising into a democratic transition. So, having women play a more, active public role, be able to be in public life, whether in politics, in civil society, in media, and so forth, as well as in the economy. This is hugely important in the development of the whole region. Regarding the United States, what I will say is I do think that the U.S. has factored this in every, in all, I see it all the time, whether in economic development programs in the region, in civil society engagement, in democracy promotion. There's always a heavy emphasis on helping to develop the capabilities and encourage the participation of women and of young people. I'm sure we can always do better, but it's also, something that the U.S. has been doing, as has Europe. You see this a lot in Europe, in Canadian, and it's something I think, the Biden administration is going to be much more multilateral in its approach to this region. And I think this is a great area for cooperation between the United States and other democratic countries and democratic allies in engaging with countries in the Middle East.
You're absolutely right, Michelle. And I think also something else worth noting is the connection, is the influence that women had actually in the Arab Spring. I mean, they played a huge role in organizing many of those protests that took place. And I think that's something that's not spoken enough or recognized enough when we talk about the Arab Spring. Elliot, Stephen, would either of you also like to chime in?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'd like to add a few thoughts here. Yeah, I think that the really awful, disparity in terms of gender equality across the Middle East and North Africa is reflective of the fact that this is the region of the world that is the most dominated by repressive, regressive, stagnant, corrupt authoritarian regimes. And Michelle mentioned the importance of women's rights in Tunisia over decades in the past decade in the successful political transition, and that's certainly true. But it's also not a coincidence today that now the only democratic country is also seeing the greatest advances in women's rights and empowerment. And there are a lot of Tunisian women who play really important roles in society. There have been important political figures, presidential candidates. The mayor of Tunis, the first kind of freely elected mayor of Tunis, was empowered as a woman, the capital city. The leading figures in political parties across the political spectrum in Tunisia that are women. And I think that if, the most important thing that we can do to see progress for women in the region is to see progress in terms of citizens' rights and openness and freedom and a level playing field. And when that's the case, you'll see that women will often stand out and excel and kind of earn, the positions of importance in the society once those opportunities are presented to them.
I would just make an obvious point, and really Michelle made it. You cannot have the kind of economic progress that the region so desperately needs if half of the people in the region are not fully participating in the economy. It just cannot happen. It's not going to happen. So from the point of view of self-interest for all of these societies, it's absolutely critical.
Absolutely. Thank you all. We have another question. I'd like to return, possibly since we spoke about the economy in the Middle East. We have a question coming from Kim Davis. Is there any sense that MBS Mohammed bin Salman may be trying to emulate the China model, maintaining a monopoly on political power, but allowing a more open economy?
Well,
Elliot, would you like to
I
comment?
think, if I jump in, yes, in one particular way, I'd put it. I think he wants to be in control of what he would call modernization. That is, I think he would say to you, look, I'm going to do this modernization stuff. I'm already doing it. I've already started it. But there's a lot of resistance and it's very hard. So I have to control the pace. So I will say how fast and how far we go. And if you don't agree then you go to jail. If you think I'm going too fast, or you think I'm going too slowly, you'd better be quiet. I'm in control of the pace here completely. I think basically that's his attitude. Now, where does he want to go at the end of this? You know, he's very young. He could be king for a very long time. He could be king, you know, any day now, in another few years, but it could last 50 years. What does he think the place is going to be like? I don't really have, I mean, I get it economically, what he thinks Saudi Arabia ought to look like in, you know, let's just start 2050, 2060. But what does he think it ought to look like politically? In the case of Morocco, I can believe, that the king may think that his son in 2050 or 60 ought to be king of a constitutional monarchy. But what do the Saudis think? I think that's a very different question.
Just quick response. I just an aside on Morocco, I don't actually see any signs that the king of Morocco envisions a constitutional monarchy in the country's future. Certainly not in the lifetime of his son. All right, you know, I would like that to be the case, but I'm not encouraged. As far as MBS, you know, I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that we just haven't seen any signs of the kind of economic competence that the Chinese regime, as odious as the Chinese regime is, it does have competence. It does have smart economists who are part of the Communist Party that are part of the decision-making process. MBS has not shown basic competence, you know, in the economic sphere, while he's trying to emulate their complete control politically that Elliot was describing. So I'm not optimistic about his ability to have success with that model.
I could just add one more thought on this. I mean, of course, there are lots of differences between Saudi Arabia and China, but I mean, one I think that has to be mentioned here, even if MBS did have, and I want to point out in case anyone doesn't know that he's not king. Okay, we're talking about the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. There still is King Salman, but you know, MBS and his vision, he might have the vision of, oh, you know, a China vision of we'll hold on to political power and diversify the economy or so forth. But the labor forces, and there's a huge difference, you know, between the vast Chinese population and I think the degree of economic freedom that people were given in China and what the labor force that exists in Saudi Arabia, their degree of training and preparedness, you know, to go out there and work hard and so forth, and the degree of sort of small freedom given, you know, to do things in the economy. It's really very different. I think that as far as I understand, that was very critical to China's economic success.
Absolutely. So I think that's a perfect avenue to go. Actually, I'm going to try to combine both of these questions. We have one question from Jack Parker and another from Angus Blair. Jack Parker mentions the future of droughts and extreme heat from climate change and how that'll affect the political economy of the Middle East. Obviously, we're talking about a region where, well, probably the most valuable resource now is oil, but I think the most valuable resource coming is going to be water. So how does the Middle East, how does this impact the political economy of the Middle East? And then I'd like to tie in Blair's question here, which is he's talking about the sustainability of job creation in the Middle East. What would the panel recommend that governments of the region do to boost employment and economic growth in this region? So essentially, you know, what is the future of the political economy of the Middle East when we tie in all these factors of climate change, lack of access to water, and how can these governments cope with that?
One point I'd like to make, which is, you know, it used to be said, for example, that one of the critical issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was water. But today it isn't because of desalination. I'm really not sure how large an issue water has to be it seems to me it's a power issue at this point. If you have the electric power, you can have all the water you want. So then you have another question. You have equity questions, you have political and economic organizational questions, but it seems to me it's less of a resource question than it looked like, maybe 25 years ago. On the second part of the question, this is a simplistic answer, but I think it's still right, education. Because that's one of the other problems of the region. Girls' education, but everybody's education. The quality and amount of education that people in the region are getting, the number of people who finish high school, the number of people who go to university is low by world standards. And again, particularly for women, the literacy rates even for women in many countries are shockingly low. So part of this change has really got to be much more investment in education.
Stephen?
Yeah, and I would just kind of, agree in that these challenges of water and resources are also very much fundamentally governance challenges. And that if, we've talked a lot throughout this panel about the failure and governance model of most of these regimes. And if they don't adapt and improve their ability to provide basic governance to oversee the management of these resources, pointing to Egypt as an example, or Yemen. I mean, those are two of the countries in the region that already are facing the most serious crises due to water. And I think it's very clear that in both cases, while the level of water resources is an issue, it's just dramatically exacerbated by sort of old antiquated systems of usage of water and the failure of the governments to adapt and provide governance.
Yeah, if I could jump in with a few points too on this. Look, I think I do think climate change is a major issue, and the rising temperatures alone. I mean, this is one of the hottest, perhaps the hottest region of the world. And there are, with rising temperatures, there are parts of the region, like parts of Iraq, some of the Gulf countries, that will become uninhabitable with rising temperatures. Okay, so I do think there will be dislocations. There are other parts of the region that now are losing arable land, due to rising water tables and salination and so forth. Parts of Egypt and so forth, like the Egyptian Delta, where they grow a tremendous amount of food. Some of this is becoming, they can't farm it anymore. Also, the water problem. I mean, desalination, I think, is it's viable for some kinds of water use, but I don't know about all of it. I mean, let's take again Egypt as an example. Egypt uses Egypt gets all of its fresh water from outside. Okay, just almost no rain falls in Egypt, and therefore all of the rain falls in another country and comes, up the Nile through Ethiopia and Sudan to Egypt. That's Egypt's situation, very water dependent. Egypt uses 85% of that fresh water on agriculture. The other 15%, is for like household use, industrial use. Yes, you can desalinate that, but are you going to desalinate water for irrigation? Not many countries can afford to do that. Now, maybe if there's a massive change in solar power and what that costs and everything, but that's far away. So there are a number of countries, the less wealthy countries and the countries that, still have big agricultural sectors, who I think face very serious water problems, and they're not ready for them. They're not ready. They don't have the technology, the water conservation practices and everything that they should have. I mean, this is why, for example, we see this big water crisis between Egypt and Ethiopia that has now built this dam on the Nile and is basically in a position to turn the tap on and off for Egypt. So I would say, I think there are going to be big climate change and water related problems in this region. And just quickly on Angus's question of how to boost employment in the region. I don't think the answer is the same for every country and every sub-region, but They really, I think they need to look at their places both in the global economy and within their regions. I think, for example, in the future, we'll see a lot more engagement in the North African countries with the rest of the African continent. We're starting to see that already as there's a lot of economic dynamism and development on the African continent that maybe, traditionally, for example, the economies of North Africa have been totally linked to Europe. And Europe will still be important, but maybe Africa as well. So, they're going to have to be looking at sectors, whether it is, agriculture, whether it is industry, whether it is services, and where they fit in. One of the sad things is that, for example, with some of the Gulf countries, UAE has been mentioned, the areas in which they tried to diversify their economies into things like logistics, business travel, tourism, things like that they're going to have to rethink a lot of that now with the pandemic and with changing global trade patterns, the possibility that there will be less trade between China and the United States, the possibility that, that more manufacturing of goods will take place on the continents in which they're consumed instead of being shipped all over the world, both because of what happened in the pandemic and because of climate change. There are some big changes coming. And so, these countries are going to have to be, on their feet and looking about themselves, and they're not going to be able to necessarily just continue to invest in the very same sectors. Just think about it for the Gulf countries. You've got oil and gas and you've got tourism. Are those really, after what we've all been through in the last year, is that where you want to be for the next 20 years? Probably not.
I think you have made wonderful points, Michelle, and there's definitely no shortage, as this panel has suggested, there's definitely no shortage of challenges facing this region. With that being said, I see David Kramer has showed up on my screen, so I think that means our time is up. To our wonderful panelists, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining. To our wonderful audience, thank you for tuning in. I hope this has been as much as an informative conversation for you as it has been for me. Elliot, Michelle, Stephen, thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Gamrawi. Thank you all for joining us today. And David, I hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Mohammed, thanks so much. Terrific job moderating, and a huge thanks to our three panelists who are regulars at State of the World. Expect an invitation to next year's, hopefully this time in Miami. So many thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it as always. We're going to take a 28-minute break, to be precise, and we'll be back for a conversation on North Korea, and hope you'll be back for then. And then we'll have two other sessions after that on this fourth day of State of the World. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The environment the students are facing today is unlike ever before.
It's all about team-based work in the 21st century of careers.
Being able to do teamwork and compromise on their positions and play the role of different sectors, the public, the private, the nonprofit sector, with different strategic priorities, and being able to combine them all and superpose them into an initiative that truly adds value to all the organizations and the actors involved.
The way that we communicate has changed.
More and more we're bringing in professionals who have a skill set that combines with the academic expertise of other faculty members that really make a difference.
I want to be able to remove the fourth wall between the classroom and the world around us.
The different experiences that the faculty and the masters has were fundamental to really understand what I needed and to gain these different points of view to become a better professional.
One of the most important dimensions, and it's really the crowning achievement of the program, is the capstones.
Capstones, for me, as somebody who comes to this work in international affairs as a practitioner, I think is one of the best parts of the program.
The value of what they did in the classroom is manifest in this particular capstone project.
It allows them to take everything that they've learned in our program up until that moment and practically apply it.
It allowed me to to develop and create innovative solutions for the corporation I work with.
It was an opportunity to understand how corporations really integrate corporate responsibility into business operations.
Students are working directly with the policymaker.
Really prepare me with the tools and skills needed to succeed at my former position at Citigroup as a problem manager for Latin America, and currently here at Rockwell Collins as the senior specialist in gold trade compliance.
If they want to pursue studies or careers in international affairs of one sort or another, whether in the government or in the private sector or in the think tank world or in academia, the FIU's MAGA program, the Green Schools MAGA program, really is a terrific way to get started.
To the person that is considering the Masters of Global Affairs here at FIU, I recommend it because it is a program that is tailored to the needs of the global market